The wind moved differently that morning. It did not rush, it did not howl, it simply drifted, slow, patient, and almost reflective, as if carrying centuries of memories across the British landscape. It slid over green hills, brushed against crumbling castle walls, rippled through tall grass, and curled around weathered gravestones in quiet churchyards. If you stood still long enough, you could almost feel it, the presence of countless lives that had come before, whispered into the present through silence. Britain is often described through its famous warriors. We speak of knights in shining armor, legendary kings, celebrated generals, and victorious soldiers. Their names fill history books, museums, and grand memorials. Their battles are retold in documentaries, films, and classrooms. But beneath those polished stories lies another Britain, one built not by famous figures, but by ordinary people whose courage was never recorded. This is the story of Britain's most forgotten warriors. Not the warriors who stood beneath royal banners, but those who stood for their families, their communities, and their survival. Not the fighters immortalized in stone, but the men and women whose sacrifices were swallowed by time. Long before Britain had a flag, a monarchy, or even a unified identity, this land was home to ancient tribes. They lived close to nature, relying on forests, rivers, and fields for survival. Their lives were simple yet fragile. Their wars were not fought for empire, but for existence. In a small tribal settlement near what is now Wales, lived a young man named Saradin. He was not a warrior by choice. His life revolved around hunting, fishing, and helping his father tend to their crops. His hands were rough, his body lean from hard work, and his spirit calm. He believed that as long as his people respected the land would protect them. But one winter, strangers arrived. They came from across the sea, tall men with iron weapons, hardened faces, and cold intentions. They did not come to trade, they came to take. Saradin watched as smoke rose from distant villages. He heard stories of families slaughtered, homes burned, and sacred lands defiled. Fear crept into his heart, but alongside it grew something stronger, a quiet determination. When the invaders reached his village, Saradin stood with the others, farmers, hunters, elders, and even women clutching simple tools. There were no drums of war, no grand speeches, no battle cries. Just trembling breaths and the knowledge that if they failed, their entire way of life would vanish. Saradin fought that day, not like a trained soldier, but like a man protecting everything he loved. His spear shook in his hands, his heart pounded in his chest. He saw friends fall beside him, blood soaking into the same soil that had fed them since birth. When the battle ended, his village still stood, battered, wounded, but alive. There were no celebrations, no statues, no songs in his honor. Saradin returned to his fields, carrying grief in his soul and scars on his body, and history forgot him. Centuries later, Britain would fall under Roman rule. Stone roads cut through the countryside like permanent scars. Massive forts rose on hilltops. The disciplined Roman legions marched in perfect formations, their armor gleaming, their presence impossible to ignore. To many, the Romans brought order, infrastructure, and civilization, but to others they brought loss, oppression, and control. In a hidden woodland camp lived a woman named Alara. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She carried no sword, wore no armor, and never stood on a battlefield. Yet her war was one of survival, compassion, and quiet resistance. Alara was a healer. Using ancient knowledge passed down through generations, she treated wounded Britons who resisted Roman rule. Under the faint glow of firelight, she crushed herbs, stitched wounds, and whispered prayers in a language older than the empire itself. She saw pain that most soldiers never would. Men trembling in agony, mothers weeping over dying sons, children clutching her hands, terrified and confused. Every night she fought against death itself, not with weapons, but with care. One evening, Roman soldiers discovered her camp. Their torches flickered like angry stars as they stormed through the trees. Panic spread. Some tried to flee, others froze in fear. Alara could have escaped, but she did not. She stayed beside a gravely wounded man, refusing to abandon him even as footsteps drew closer. When the soldiers seized her, she did not scream, she did not beg. She simply held her head high, her eyes filled with quiet defiance. No Roman record mentioned her name, no monument honored her bravery. Alara disappeared into history, another forgotten warrior who fought not with steel, but with compassion. As the centuries passed, Britain entered the age of castles and knights. Towering stone fortresses dominated the skyline. Armored warriors rode into battle beneath banners bearing lions, dragons, and crosses. Stories of chivalry, honor, and heroism spread across the land. Yet behind every knight there were countless unseen warriors. In a small, rain-soaked village near the coast lived a blacksmith named William Harrow. He was not born into nobility, he owned no land, he wore no crest, but his hands shaped the very weapons that decided life and death on the battlefield. Day after day, he stood before a blazing forge, hammering red-hot iron into swords, spears, and shields. Sparks flew like tiny stars. His muscles burned, his skin blistered, his ears rang with the endless clash of metal. Knights rode proudly into war carrying blades he had crafted. When they returned victorious, they were praised as heroes. When they fell, their names were mourned in courts and chronicles. William remained in his forge, alone, exhausted, forgotten. One brutal winter, enemy raiders attacked his village. The castle was too far, the knights were away. Panic spread through the streets. William did not hesitate. He picked up one of his own swords, a weapon meant for someone else's glory, and stood at the edge of the village. He fought not for a king, but for the people who had trusted him their entire lives. By dawn, the raiders had retreated, but William lay lifeless beside the river, his sword still clenched in his hand. His sacrifice saved many lives, yet no bard sang of his bravery. The water carried his blood away, and time carried his name with it. Then came the age of empire. Britain expanded across the world, sending ships to distant lands, claiming territories and building an empire that stretched across continents. Soldiers in red marched through jungles, deserts, and mountains, fighting wars far from home. Among them was a young private named Edward Blake. He did not dream of glory. He joined the army because poverty left him no choice. His family struggled to survive. His mother worked day and night just to put food on the table. The army promised stability. Edward was sent to a land he had never heard of, a place of scorching heat, unfamiliar languages, and harsh terrain. The people he was ordered to fight did not look like the enemies he had imagined. In battle, Edward saw things that shattered his innocence. Burning villages, crying children, desperate men fighting to protect their homes, just as Saradin had centuries before. Slowly, he realized that war was not as noble as the stories claimed. One night, during a chaotic firefight, Edward saw a fellow soldier wounded and trapped. Without thinking, he rushed through gunfire, dragging the man to safety at great risk to his own life. His act of bravery was never recorded. Weeks later, Edward himself was shot. He died far from Britain, buried in an unmarked grave beneath foreign soil. His family received a short letter of condolence, but no one beyond them ever remembered his name. The empire marched on. Wars continued, flags flew, medals were awarded, and forgotten warriors kept falling. Then came the two world wars, conflicts so vast they reshaped the entire world. Britain stood at the center of history once again. Cities burned under relentless air raids, families huddled in underground shelters, sirens wailed through the night like haunting ghosts. This was not just a war of soldiers, it was a war of ordinary people turned warriors by necessity. In a factory in northern England worked a young woman named Margaret Hayes. Her job was to build aircraft parts, small, precise, but absolutely crucial for the war effort. Her hands were cracked from metal, her back aching from long shifts, her eyes heavy from sleepless nights. Every day she wondered if her brother, fighting on the front lines, was still alive. One evening, bombs fell dangerously close to her factory. Windows shattered, the ground shook, many workers fled in terror. Margaret did not. She stayed at her station, finishing a critical component that could determine whether a British pilot lived or died in the skies above Britain. Dust filled the air, sirens screamed, fear gripped her heart. Still, she worked. When the war ended, soldiers marched in victory parades, generals received medals, their names filled newspapers and history books. Margaret returned to her quiet life, unseen, unthanked, unremembered. Even after the wars ended, Britain's forgotten warriors did not disappear.